Hello, welcome to another Becoming a Modern Man. We're playing Grishoalbrand once again, and this time we are running up against Shadow Zoo. So this is our opening hand, which we can be fairly happy with. We've got Faithless Looting, Discovery, Dispersal, Through the Breach, and Goryo's Vengeance. So we've got our reanimation spells, we just need the creatures to go with them, and Faithless Looting and Discovery are cards that can help us achieve that. So very happy with this hand. So we're on a draw here. Our opponent leads with Arid Mesa, getting Blood Crypt into a Monastery Swift Sphere, attacking us for 1. So we're not entirely sure what our opponent's up to just yet. They could very well be some sort of burn deck, although red-white is generally the preferred colours, but you never know. Black is also an option. So yeah, we're not entirely sure what's going on here. So I wasn't necessarily all in on casting Faithless Looting on turn 1, basically because it's like our primary way of discarding cards from our hand, so sometimes it's useful to keep it around so you can pitch the cards you want, rather than using it as just a dig spell blindly, because obviously currently there isn't really anything we want to discard from our hand necessarily. But as it turns out, we draw into a second Faithless Looting, so I'm more comfortable casting Faithless Looting here blindly. Obviously, the advantage of casting Faithless Looting as well here is that potentially we can find the turn 2 win if we could if we can find a Grishoalbrand, and then we could potentially just win the game on turn 2. Unfortunately, we don't find Grishoalbrand with the Faithless Looting. We find Boborygmos and a Blood Crypt, both of which we pretty much want to pitch into the graveyard. But that does give us some options here as well. Goryo's Vengeance on Boborygmos isn't going to win us the game necessarily, but it is a fairly good play in and of itself. We can attack and then potentially wipe some of their board by pitching some lands if we can afford to do so, so that's a consideration here. So opponent attacks for 1, drops a Dread Horde Arcanist, which is one of the new cards from the War of the Spark set. So the other videos were pre-War of the Spark. Yeah, it's just hit the shelves now at the time of recording. I've had to stretch these videos out over sort of a few weeks, so this is the only video I think that's going to have War of the Spark cards in it. But yeah, this card's kind of interesting. It's potentially a repeatable Snapcaster, so I think it's certainly powerful, but I just don't know whether it's going to be good enough for Modern. Certainly the top decks that I would think would use it seem to have better options, but it's certainly a cool card at any rate. But I mean, I guess a bit slow in this circumstance, particularly given our opponent's deck. So we could Faithless Looting here, or we could Discovery Dispersal. I mean, I suppose alternatively we could Goryo's Vengeance, Boborygmos, kill both of their creatures and attack for 7, which is another option, but then we're left with no lands and... yeah, well, I mean, I suppose we get to potentially draw some lands off Boborygmos when it attacks, but I think that's a riskier play than we need to make here. But again, just pointing out the different potential lines here that could have been used. So instead we're going to go Discovery. Again, we could have Faithless Looting instead, but I think I prefer just using Discovery here to see dig us a little bit deeper. We find the second Boborygmos and a land, neither of which we want. And that draws us into a Whirlspine Worm. Put Lightning Bolts themselves. Seems to indicate they're a Death's Shadow deck, which kind of was the indication I got when they played a Steam event. So they get to cast the Lightning Bolt for 3 off the Arcanist, puts down to 15, give me for 4, and then follow that up with a Death's Shadow. We draw Grishoalbrand on my turn, and our turn, and basically we can kill our opponent several ways. Actually, pretty much every way imaginable. Any of the creatures we can get back is a pretty solid kill, I think, as we stand. So we can get back, we can Goryo's Vengeance Bogarigmos, attack for 7, that puts that one down to 5. Actually, no, that deals 4, and then we get 2 lands. Yeah, I suppose Boomerang is not necessarily a kill. Actually, no, we've still got 2 lands, so that's 6. Plus the 4 we deal with the trample from Bogarigmos. So yeah, so we can get back Bogarigmos. That's probably the more risky play, I suppose. We can face the saluting into Goryo's Vengeance on World Spineworm and attack for 15 trample, which should kill our opponent nicely. Or alternatively, we can do the more traditional thing and get Grishoalbrand back into play. So I think that's the line I go for. I think in hindsight, the best line was probably just to reanimate the World Spineworm in the least effort category. So here we're going off, gaining 11 life off these Nourishing Shoals. Draw several cards actually we've got 11 cards in hand. We could draw a significantly deeper, but it doesn't really matter at this point. We've got enough lands to kill our opponent, so we're just going to Goryo's Vengeance Bogarigmos, and then we can pitch all our lands our opponent's face and finish them off. Actually, we could kill Death Shadow as well along the way, and all their creatures. So even if we weren't able to get a kill, I think that would be good enough. But yeah, that wraps up game 1 quite nicely. So let's take a look at sideboarding. Okay, so here we are with our deck. In terms of sideboarding options against Shadow Zoo, I suppose we can go a number of different ways. There's a number of potential cards that are good in this matchup. Blood Moon isn't too bad, given that there are sort of several colours, usually 4 or 5. We've also got Chalice of the Void, which is one of the main cards that I was looking at. A lot of their deck costs 1 mana, so Chalice on 1 is pretty effective. And can probably lock them out of a lot of their spells. Engineered Explosives, again, similar situation. They've got a lot of 1 mana creatures, so potentially we can use that just to wipe the board. Bontu's Last Reckoning is also an option, just as a board clearer, given that they're a creature-focused kill. So I think the main cards I want to bring in are the way I did play this game. I decided that I'd wanted to bring in Chalice of the Void, so I brought in those and the Engineered Explosives. I decided not to bother with Bontu's Last Reckoning. I think Blood Moon's probably just too slow. Potentially arguable that I should have brought in Bontu's Last Reckoning as well. But yeah, so I brought in the Chalice. I decided to take out the 3 of the Faithless Lootings and the Lightning Axe. That does weaken our combo a little bit, particularly in terms of the Goryo's Vengeance, but I thought it was worth a risk just because Chalice is going to be so good in this matchup, and we can happily play a slightly slower game where we eventually just get through the breach and kill our opponent, or potentially discard cards or pitch our creatures other ways, such as Discovery. So yeah, so that's the way I went. I mean, I suppose maybe Night's Whisper is also a card we could have potentially cut, but I thought given that we're bringing in Chalice and planning to play it on 1, that we were better off cutting off the 1 mana spells. But interesting to see, know anyone's thoughts on this, anyone who's played the deck, as to whether that's the best way to go about things, or whether you just keep the Faithless Lootings in case you don't get the Chalice. But yeah, I think potentially we could have not brought in Chalice and just went for the Engineered Explosives and the Bontu's Last Reckonings, I suppose would be the alternative, and then we keep our combo that little bit faster, but at the same time we were potentially risking getting blown out by their numerous 1-drops, so or just Bontu's Last Reckoning generally being a little bit slow. So I don't know entirely what the best plan is, but that's the one I went with, and I stand behind it. I think that was a good play. I think Chalice for 1 is going to be particularly good, potentially given that we're going to be on the draw. Maybe we should have gone with the Last Reckonings for when we were on the draw, and then the Chalices when we were on the play, potentially, given if we lose, of course. So that's a worthwhile consideration. But yeah, I went with the Chalice of the Voids and the Engineered Explosives, and then cutting our one mana spells just to a single Faithless Looting. Okay, so this is our opener for game 2. It's not the worst, but it's also not the best. We're basically hoping to cast Discovery several times and hope that leads to something. So I'm not really too happy with this. We do get to Temple of Malice, Scry, and then Discovery, but we kind of need a lot to make this hand good, so I decided to ship it back. So this hand is better for sure. We've got the Chalice of the Void that we wanted to bring in. So that's nice, we're going to be able to stick that on 1. We've got Nourishing Shoal plus Worldspine Worm, which is kind of good in itself. Obviously it's part of our ongoing combo, but at the same time, against a deck that's just looking to sort of aggro you, gaining 11 life is pretty good. And will buy us quite a lot of time. So that's a relevant consideration. And then we've got the Discovery Dispersal. It's hopefully going to dig us a bit deeper. We also have Ritual, but I think we're going to put that on the bottom. We don't really need that until we're going off. I mean, sometimes it gets you a 1 turn quicker clock, but I think of the cards here, that's certainly the one that we want to put at the bottom. So we'll bottom the Ritual. Going to cast Steam Vents into a Swift Spear. Hits us for 1, which is fine. Just play a Swamp, opponent cycles a Street Wraith, plays a Bloodstained Mire, gets an Overgrown Tomb, and plays a Grafdigger's Cage. So that's very relevant. It's going to prevent us from using Goryo's Vengeance to reanimate anything, so we're looking to be on the Through the Breach plan now, which obviously slows us down. Fortunately, our opponent didn't really run anything else out and didn't get on low enough life to cast a Death Shadow, which is very good for us because we are potentially going to be able to drop this Chalice here, which should buy us a good amount of time to get to Through the Breach. We also draw Through the Breach, which is nice too. Unfortunately, our opponent has Spell Pierce waiting and ready for this Chalice of the Void and uses that there. Although in some ways that's quite good, given that it means that our reanimation spells, or our opponent is at least 1 disruption spell down for use on our reanimation spells. And that certainly would have been a lot worse if we were being hit for one of our reanimation spells, but obviously showing you the power of Chalice in this matchup and how important our opponent thought it was. Here we're going to be able to cast Discovery. And we see both our reanimation spells, so there's Goryo's Vengeance and Through the Breach here. We certainly don't want Goryo's in this situation, given that the opponent has Grafdigger's Cage, so it's not a card we really want to draw. I mean, really, at this point, we're just looking to get enough mana to cast Through the Breach. We can splice it onto Nourishing Shoal when we use Nourishing Shoal, which will allow us to cast it for 4, so we only need to get a 4th land, realistically. The risk of binning both these cards is that our opponent could potentially Surgical Through the Breach, so maybe we should have kept Through the Breach here. I decided to bin both and just dig closer to a land, but yeah, certainly if our opponent had Surgical Through the Breach at that point, then we would have been in pretty bad shape. I'm not entirely sure we'd have a good way of winning the game, so that's a relevant consideration, and certainly drawing Through the Breach, a second Through the Breach wouldn't have been awful, but certainly we want to be hitting our land drops as much as possible. But yeah, I mean, if we knew our opponent had Surgical, I think we would have kept the Through the Breach there to avoid that scenario. So cast Temple of Malice, that shows us a Discovery Dispersal on top. I'm going to bottom that. I'm kind of hoping this Goblin Guide is going to draw us a land, but even if it doesn't, we do have the Simian Spirit Guide that we drew. So we do have 4 mana for next turn, which is enough for the combo. So yes, Goblin Guide does draw us a land, but unfortunately it's a Temple of Malice, which is going to come into play tapped. So we are going to have to use this Simian Spirit Guide to cast, well, Splice through the breach. So Nourishing Shoal, Splice on through the breach, looking to gain 11 here. Fortunately, our opponent has a second Spell Pierce. We get attacked for 3 again. But yeah, the second Spell Pierce is not the end of the world, basically, because, of course, we have another Nourishing Shoal Worldspine Worm combination. Otherwise, we would have been in quite a bit of trouble there. So we can Nourishing Shoal, splicing on through the breach once again. We could have also spliced on Desperate Ritual. I don't know if that necessarily does anything though. I suppose it would have given us an extra mana. Maybe we should have done that in hindsight, because things do get a little bit tricky later on, as you're about to see. Well, it's all part of the same turn, to be honest. So we get our Goryo's Vengeance into play. I guess we probably should have spliced the Desperate Ritual on as well, just to get that extra mana. But basically, draw 7 cards. We do have to be aware that of our life total, given that our opponent potentially could have Lightning Bolt, but we are going to go down to 5, which is fine. Unfortunately, the cards we draw are not really the ones we were looking for. Basically, we will want to hit Simian Spirit Guides and more copies of Nourishing Shoal Worldspine Worm, or just Nourishing Shoal in general, I guess. So yeah, this is not ideal. We haven't found Boborygmos, we haven't found more copies of Simian Spirit Guide to boost our mana, and we haven't found Nourishing Shoals to boost our life to dig us further. So this is a pretty big whiff. It's not the end of the world. Our opponent's on 13. We can just attack for 7 and then discard down, which isn't too bad. We get to a reasonable life total. So we're on 12. Our opponent doesn't currently have 12 damage available to them. I mean, and they've only got 2 cards in hand, so we'd probably live another turn, and then which point we can potentially through the breach something else. Although, is to be noted that we don't actually have anything either. Like, we haven't drawn any cards to reanimate. We haven't drawn a Grishoalbrand. We haven't drawn another Worldspine Worm, so we actually don't have anything necessarily set up for next turn. So that is kind of the bigger problem. It wouldn't have been the end of the world if we'd had something solid for next turn, but we actually don't currently. So that is a problem. So we're going to attack for 7, which we would have done anyway, which puts our opponent down to 6. Seeing our position that we don't actually have a reanimation set up, I think we just want to push for it and see if we can try and put the combo together. So we draw 7 more cards, and it's not exactly the dream. So yeah, we're not actually in a position to combo off. Here we need to combo with Through the Breach, because obviously we don't have Goryo's Vengeance, so this Mana Morphos isn't as good as it otherwise would have been. We would have had enough mana to Goryo's Vengeance, but we actually don't have Boborygmos in the graveyard either, so we're kind of a way off on a lot of fronts, and we've run out of life to do anything else. So we are going to have to pass the turn, but I kind of had a long time looking at this hand, trying to see what we can do, and there is an answer in here. I mean, feel free to pause the video and try and figure it out. I appreciate that you can't probably see the cards quite as well as I can. But yeah, after a while, I managed to figure out the solution to our problem. or at least a way to not just die next turn, because our opponent has got 5 points of damage. So what I did was I am going to exile Simian Spirit Guide. We're going to cast Desperate Ritual. Oh, I'm going to play a land as well. To cast Desperate Ritual, sorry. And then we are going to cast Engineered Explosives for 1. And then sacrifice it with the rest of our mana, which nicely clears out our opponent's board. We are going to have to exile Grishoalbrand at the end of turn. Cast Chalice for 0. I don't think our opponent's got any 0s, but I figured it might as well be on the battlefield rather than not on the battlefield, just in case our opponent does have any, I don't know, Pact of Negation or something like that. It seems unlikely, but I figured it was better than just losing it. And now we can discard down, so we're going to have to discard down to a reasonable hand. We've actually got rid of Grafdigger's Cage now, so Goryo's Vengeance is a legitimate strategy once again. So, got several options. Our opponent draws and plays a Death Shadow. I assume that that was their draw for the turn. I can't quite remember, but it seems unlikely. Basically, our considerations here are now that our opponent potentially has Spell Pierce, although they've played 2 at this point, so it seems not wholly likely that they've got Spell Pierce. Or alternatively, they might have Stubborn Denial, although running both seems slightly strange. I think either way, we're basically dead if that happens. I mean, not Spell Pierce, I suppose. You can play around Spell Pierce by Goryo's Vengeancing the Grishoalbrand that's in the graveyard. Although then the alternative is also if they had Surgical, although we haven't seen Surgical so far, so it seems unlikely that that's hanging around. So yeah, I mean, there's multiple ways to potentially win the game. If our opponent has any way to interact, there's a good chance that we lose. I decide basically for style points, if anything. Really, I think the best play was probably, given that we know our opponent has Spell Pierce in their deck, even though we seed 2 copies, is just to Goryo's Vengeance on the Grishoalbrand, and then we can pay for a Spell Pierce if necessary. But I decide for style points just to splice on a Through the Breach as well, which gets us to drop Worldspine Worm for double security, just in case our opponent has Vapor Snag or something, I guess, is the play around. I don't think our opponent is likely to have Vapor Snag either, but there you go. I think, yeah, as I say, the best play was probably just to Goryo's Vengeance, the Grishoalbrand. Unlikely our opponent has a way to interact with that, and then we just get to attack Fly over for 7. But as it was, we get to drop both our fatties, which is a lot more fun. And then that wraps up the game. So yeah, pretty good matchup, pretty fun to play around. Particularly the Almost Fizzle was a particularly good sort of head scratcher for me, and hopefully for you too. And yeah, this matchup went fairly well. I'm not so sure about the bringing in Chalice. I think bringing in Chalice is pretty good though, if you can stick it early. But maybe it's better on the draw, I mean on the play rather than on the draw, because potentially you're just too slow. I don't know. It's an interesting one. But let me know your thoughts and in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed this match.